She was 30 seconds from losing everything: her job, her apartment, her daughter's next inhaler refill, when she made the worst decision of her life. She stopped to help the most dangerous man in the city, and he never let her go. If you're still watching by the end of this story, hit that like button and drop the name of the city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to hit different. The fluorescent light above bed 14 had been flickering for 6 days straight. Nobody from maintenance came. Nobody ever came for anything on the 3rd floor of St. Mercy Hospital unless someone was actively dying, and even then the response time averaged 11 minutes on a good night. Tonight was not a good night. Imani Carter felt the buzzing of that broken light somewhere behind her left eye, a dull electric pulse that matched the throbbing in her lower back from 9 consecutive hours on her feet. Her blue scrubs had a coffee stain near the hip from where she'd bumped into a crash cart around hour 3, and her shoes, the cheap ones from the discount rack at Payless, the ones already separating at the sole, squeaked against the linoleum with every step like they were personally trying to announce her exhaustion to the entire ward. She was moving fast. Not running, because running in the hallway triggered incident reports, and incident reports triggered conversations with Denise Watkins, the floor supervisor who kept a leather-bound notebook full of infractions the way some people kept photo albums. Denise had already written Imani up 3 times in 2 months. The first was for clocking in 4 minutes late after Zuri's school bus didn't show, and she had to drive her daughter across town in a borrowed car with no air conditioning. The second was for leaving a supply closet unlocked, a closet that didn't even have a functioning lock, which Imani had pointed out, which Denise had noted as argumentative behavior during corrective counseling. The third was for speaking too loudly to a confused elderly patient at 2 in the morning. 3 strikes. 1 more, and she was out. Not suspended, not reassigned, gone. And gone meant no paycheck. No paycheck meant no rent. No rent meant shelter applications, public assistance lines, and the specific kind of desperation that kept her up at night staring at the ceiling of her cramped 1-bedroom apartment while Zuri wheezed softly in the bed beside her. Zuri's asthma medication cost $412 a month without insurance. The hospital insurance was the only reason Imani could afford it. Lose the job, lose the insurance, lose the medication, and then what? Emergency rooms and prayers? She'd already burned through that playbook twice. So she moved fast, not running, walking with violent purpose through the overcrowded corridor, dodging gurneys and IV stands, and the particular chaos that descended on St. Mercy every Friday night when the emergency department overflowed and dumped its excess humanity onto every floor that had an empty bed. Rain hammered the windows so hard the glass seemed to vibrate. The storm had knocked out power to half the neighborhood 3 hours ago, and while the hospital generators held, the backup lighting cast everything in a sickly yellow that made healthy people look terminal, and terminal people look already gone. Imani rounded the corner near the west elevator bank and nearly killed a man. Not literally, but close enough that she felt the impact vibrate through her knees as her shin caught the metal footrest of a wheelchair, and she stumbled forward, catching herself on the wall with one hand while her clipboard clattered to the floor and papers scattered across the wet linoleum like startled birds. "I'm sorry," she said automatically, the words leaving her mouth before she even registered what she'd hit. "I'm so sorry, I didn't see—" She stopped. The man in the wheelchair was looking at her the way a predator watches movement in tall grass. Not angry, not startled, just aware. Completely, unnervingly aware. He was somewhere north of 50, though the exact number was hard to pin down. His hair was black shot through with silver at the temples, combed back from a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than bone. High cheekbones, a strong jaw darkened by 2 days of stubble, and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than 3 months of Imani's rent. She could tell because the fabric didn't wrinkle the way normal clothes did. It draped like liquid over shoulders that were still broad despite whatever had put him in the chair. But the suit couldn't hide everything. His skin carried a grayish undertone beneath the olive complexion, the kind of color that meant something internal was going wrong. His breathing was shallow, controlled in a way that suggested each inhale cost him something he didn't want to show, and his left hand gripped the armrest of the wheelchair with knuckles that had gone white, as though he was holding himself together through sheer force of will. Imani had worked in hospitals long enough to recognize a man fighting his own body. She'd also worked in this city long enough to recognize the name on the intake bracelet partially visible beneath his sleeve cuff. DeLuca. Her stomach dropped 3 floors. Everyone in the city knew the DeLuca name. Not from newspapers. The DeLucas kept themselves out of newspapers, the way most people kept themselves out of traffic. You learned the name from whispers, from the particular silence that fell over a room when their cars pulled up outside a restaurant, from the bartender who stopped talking mid-sentence when someone mentioned the shipping ports downtown, from the neighbor who told you never, ever to park in the loading zone behind Rialto's on 9th Street, and when you asked why, just shook her head and changed the subject. Vincenzo DeLuca controlled half the city's nightlife, most of its port operations, and an unknowable percentage of its political machinery. He wasn't a celebrity. He was a gravitational force. Things orbited around him, or they got pulled in and crushed. And Imani had just rammed her shin into his wheelchair hard enough to rattle the spokes. She picked up her clipboard. Her hands weren't shaking, which surprised her. Maybe she was too tired for fear. Maybe the thing about being this close to losing everything was that the proximity to disaster started feeling normal. "I'm sorry about that," she said again, meeting his eyes, because looking away felt more dangerous. "Are you waiting for transport?" He watched her for a long moment. Rain hit the windows behind him. The fluorescent lights buzzed. "They said 10 minutes," he said. His voice was low, quieter than she expected, with a faint rasp that could have been pain or could have been the way he always sounded. "That was 20 minutes ago." Imani looked up and down the corridor. No orderlies, no transport staff. Friday night during a storm, which meant every available body was either downstairs dealing with the ER overflow or hiding in the break room pretending to be downstairs dealing with the ER overflow. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Radiology, basement level." She should have nodded politely and kept walking. That was the smart move, the safe move. She had vitals to check on 3 patients, a medication reconciliation form to complete, and approximately 45 minutes before Denise did her nightly walkthrough with that notebook and those reading glasses and that tight-lipped expression that said, "I'm looking for a reason." But Imani Carter had spent her entire life being practical, and practical had gotten her a 1-bedroom apartment with roaches, a daughter who couldn't breathe without pharmaceutical intervention, and a job that treated her like furniture. Sometimes practical wasn't enough. Sometimes the only thing left was the stubborn, irrational impulse to do the decent thing, even when the decent thing might cost you everything. "I'll take you down," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not gratitude. Men like this didn't do gratitude. More like assessment. He was recalculating something about her, adjusting an internal equation she wasn't supposed to see. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She moved behind the wheelchair, released the brake with her foot, and started pushing. He was heavier than she expected, or maybe the chair was old because the wheels resisted at first, squeaking against the floor before finding their rhythm. The corridor was quiet. Most of the overhead lights were on backup power, casting the hallway in alternating patches of yellow and shadow. Somewhere behind them, a monitor beeped steadily. Somewhere ahead, a door closed with the heavy metallic sound that only hospital doors made. "You work this floor?" he asked without turning around. "4th floor usually. They pulled me down here because they're short-staffed." Short-staffed on a Friday night. Short-staffed every night. Friday just makes it worse. He made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had more air in it. "Healthcare system." "It's a whole situation," she said. They reached the elevator bank. Imani hit the down button and waited. The display above the door showed the car somewhere on the 7th floor, moving slowly. Everything in this building moved slowly, except the patients toward the door. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, not because she was afraid to give it. Names were just names. But because something about the way he asked carried weight, like he was filing it somewhere permanent. "Imani Carter." Imani. He repeated it once, testing the shape of it. "That's a strong name." "My mother picked it." She picked well. The elevator arrived with a chime that sounded half dead. The doors opened to an empty car with scratched walls and a floor sticky with something she didn't want to identify. Imani pushed the wheelchair in, turned it to face the doors, and pressed B for basement. The doors closed. The car lurched downward. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the lights flickered. Then Vincenzo DeLuca made a sound she'd never forget, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, followed by a guttural groan as his right hand flew to his chest, and his entire body seized forward in the chair like something had reached inside his ribcage and squeezed. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" He didn't answer. His face had gone from gray to white in the space of a heartbeat, and sweat broke across his forehead in a way that turned his skin almost translucent. His left hand still gripped the armrest, but his right was clawing at the front of his suit jacket like he was trying to pull his own sternum apart. Imani dropped to her knees in front of him. Training kicked in. The muscle memory of 1,000 shifts spent keeping people alive who were trying their hardest to die. "I need you to look at me," she said. Firm. Direct. No room for negotiation. "Look at my face. Can you tell me what you're feeling?" His eyes found hers. For a fraction of a second, she saw something beneath the pain that shocked her. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something older and deeper. Something that looked like exhaustion, like a man who had spent decades building walls and was now watching them crumble from the inside. "Chest," he managed. "Pressure. Left side." "How long?" "Started." He clenched his jaw. Breathed through his teeth. "Hour ago. Thought it would pass." Of course he did. Men like this always thought it would pass. Men like this would rather bleed out in a back alley than admit they needed help. Imani hit the emergency call button on the elevator panel. Static. She hit it again. Nothing. The storm had probably knocked out the intercom system along with everything else. "Okay, listen to me," she said, keeping her voice steady, even as her pulse started its own quiet sprint. "When these doors open, I'm going to get you help immediately, but right now I need you to slow your breathing. Can you do that?" He stared at her. His pupils were dilated wide, almost eclipsing the dark irises. "You're not a doctor." "No. You're not a nurse. Certified nursing assistant. But I've been doing this job long enough to know what a cardiac event looks like. And right now, you're having one. So stop arguing and breathe." Something happened then. Something small and enormous at the same time. The most feared man in the city, the man who commanded an empire through silence and the threat of violence, looked at Imani Carter in her stained scrubs and her cheap shoes and her barely holding it together life. And he listened. He breathed, slowly, deliberately, matching the rhythm she demonstrated. In through the nose, hold out through the mouth. His hand was still pressed against his chest, but the clawing had stopped. The color wasn't returning to his face, but it wasn't getting worse. The elevator reached the basement with a mechanical groan. The doors opened to a dark corridor that smelled like disinfectant and recycled air. Imani was already shouting, "I need help! I need a crash cart and a doctor now!" Her voice bounced off the empty walls. Radiology at this hour was a skeleton crew. One technician, maybe two, and they were probably in the back behind lead-lined doors where they couldn't hear anything short of a bomb. She pushed the wheelchair out of the elevator and ran. Not walked. Ran. Incident reports could burn. She found the tech, a young guy named Marcus with headphones around his neck and a startled expression. And the words came out of her in a torrent. Cardiac event, chest pressure, left side, onset approximately 1 hour, male patient mid-50s. She didn't mention the name because the name didn't matter right now. What mattered was the crash cart and the phone and the code she needed called. Marcus moved. To his credit, he moved fast. The code went out over the PA system, and within 4 minutes, the basement corridor was flooded with people. A resident, 2 nurses, an attending who appeared like she'd materialized from the walls, all of them converging on the man in the wheelchair with the kind of controlled urgency that meant they understood the situation was real. They transferred him to a gurney, started an IV, hooked monitors. The attending was barking orders, and the resident was pulling medication, and the nurses were working with the silent precision of people who did this every night. Imani stepped back. She was supposed to step back. She wasn't part of this team. She wasn't even supposed to be on this floor. But as they started to wheel him toward the cardiac unit, Vincenzo's hand shot out and caught her wrist. His grip was weak, nothing like the iron control she imagined he usually carried. His fingers were cold and slightly damp with sweat, and they wrapped around her wrist with the desperate clumsiness of a man grasping for a lifeline he hadn't expected to find. "Don't leave me!" 3 words, barely audible above the monitors and the shouting and the wheels of the gurney rattling against the floor. His eyes were glassy from pain, but they were locked on hers with an intensity that felt like a physical weight against her chest. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then at the team already moving him down the corridor, then back at his face. "I'm right here," she said. She walked beside this gurney until they pushed through the double doors of the cardiac unit, and a nurse firmly told her she couldn't go further. She stood in the corridor watching through the narrow window as they worked on him, her own heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. 20 minutes later, the attending came out. He was stable. They were running tests. It looked like a serious arrhythmia episode complicated by what appeared to be chronic stress cardiomyopathy. He'd need to stay at least 48 hours for monitoring. Imani nodded, thanked the doctor, turned to go back upstairs, and walked directly into Denise Watkins. Denise stood in the corridor like a monument to bureaucratic disapproval. Notebook open, reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, lips compressed into a line so thin they nearly disappeared. "You abandoned your patients," Denise said. "I had a cardiac emergency. You're a CNA on the 4th floor. You are not authorized to transport patients. You are not authorized to call codes. You are not authorized to be in the basement radiology unit at," she checked her watch, "11:47 p.m. on a Friday night when you have 3 patients upstairs who haven't had their vitals checked in over an hour." "The man was having a heart attack in the elevator, Denise. What was I supposed to do, press the button for his floor and wave goodbye?" Denise's eyes narrowed. The notebook came up. The pen came out. "That's your 4th incident, Carter." The words landed like a punch to the sternum. Not because they were unexpected, Imani had known this was coming the moment she'd grabbed that wheelchair, but because knowing a thing is coming doesn't stop it from hurting when it arrives. "You can't be serious. I've documented every conversation we've had about professional boundaries and authorized duties. You were given clear warnings. You chose to ignore them." "I chose to keep a man alive." "You chose to leave your assigned post without authorization. HR will process the termination paperwork by Monday. You can finish your shift tonight or leave now. I'd recommend leaving now." Imani stared at her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The rain kept hammering. Somewhere behind those double doors, a man she'd saved was lying in a hospital bed hooked to machines. And out here, the woman with the notebook was ending her career over a line in a policy manual. She thought about arguing. She thought about begging. She thought about the $412 a month and the inhaler sitting on the nightstand beside Zuri's bed, and the sound her daughter made at 3 a.m. when the wheezing started and the medicine was running low. "You know what, Denise?" Imani said quietly. "I'd do it again." She turned and walked toward the elevator. Her shoes squeaked against the floor. The sound echoed down the empty corridor like a slow hand clap. By the time she got home, it was almost 1 a.m. The apartment was dark except for the nightlight plugged into the outlet near the bathroom, a cheap plastic butterfly that cast a warm orange glow across the narrow hallway. Zuri was asleep in the bed they shared, curled on her side with one arm wrapped around a stuffed elephant whose name was Gerald and whose left ear was hanging by 3 threads. Imani stood in the doorway and watched her daughter breathe. The inhaler sat on the nightstand, half empty. 2 weeks until the next refill. The math ran through her head on autopilot. Rent due in 12 days, electric bill past due, the notice from the landlord she'd been pretending didn't exist. She sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw colors. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury, and Imani Carter didn't do luxuries. Instead, she sat in the dark and listened to her daughter's breathing and started building a plan out of nothing, the way she always did, the way her mother had done before her, the way Black women in this city had been doing since the city existed. Tomorrow, she'd file for unemployment, call the community health center about emergency medication assistance, check the job boards, maybe pick up shifts at the urgent care clinic on Broad Street if they were still hiring. She'd survive. She always survived. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that 3 miles across the city, in the cardiac unit of St. Mercy Hospital, Vincenzo DeLuca was lying awake staring at the ceiling with an oxygen cannula in his nose and a monitor tracking every beat of his damaged heart. And he was asking his people to find her. The first call went to Marco Bianchi, his consigliere, and the only man who had direct access to Vincenzo's personal line at any hour. Marco picked up on the second ring because when Vincenzo DeLuca called at 2 a.m, you answered on the second ring or you answered for it later. "The woman who brought me down," Vincenzo said. His voice was raw, scraped thin by whatever medication they'd pushed through his IV. The one in the blue scrubs. What about her? Find her. Marco was quiet for 3 seconds. In the world they operated in, 3 seconds of silence was an eternity. Boss, you just had a cardiac event. The doctors want you resting. Marco. One word. That was all it took. Marco had worked for Vincenzo for 22 years. He knew the difference between a request and an order. This was neither. It was something else. Something he'd never heard in Vincenzo's voice before. Need. I'll have a name and address by morning, Marco said. You'll have it by dawn. The call ended. Vincenzo set the phone on his chest and stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the water stains the way other people counted sheep. His chest ached. Not the sharp electric pain from the elevator, that had been blunted by medication into a dull, persistent pressure, like someone had placed a stone on his sternum and forgotten to remove it. But beneath the physical pain was something else, something harder to medicate. He kept seeing her face, not her features. Those he could barely recall in the fog of pain and drugs. What he remembered was the way she'd dropped to her knees in front of him without hesitation, the way her voice had cut through the panic like a blade through cloth, the way she'd told him to breathe, and he'd done it, just like that. No negotiation, no power play. She'd given an order, and the Mafia Boss had obeyed. That hadn't happened in 30 years. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. It rarely did. The nights were the worst, the hours between midnight and dawn when the empire went quiet and the noise in his head got loud. His wife, Sophia, had been dead for 7 years. Cancer. The only enemy he couldn't threaten, bribe, or kill. He'd spent $300,000 on specialists, experimental treatments, private clinics in Switzerland. None of it mattered. She died on a Tuesday afternoon in this same hospital, 2 floors up, while he held her hand and felt the exact moment her fingers went slack. After that, something inside Vincenzo didn't break. It calcified. The grief turned to stone, and the stone turned to armor, and the armor turned him into something efficient and merciless and completely alone. He ran the empire with mechanical precision, expanded operations, eliminated competitors, built a financial network so complex that federal investigators had been trying to untangle it for a decade without success. But he did all of it from inside a shell that felt increasingly like a coffin. Until tonight. Until a woman in stained scrubs and broken shoes told him to breathe, and he remembered what it felt like to let someone else be strong. Dawn came gray and wet. The storm had passed but left the city looking bruised, puddles in every pothole, trash scattered across sidewalks, a sky the color of dirty concrete. Marco called at 5:47 a.m. Imani Carter, 31 years old. CNA at St. Mercy, 4th floor. Single mother, 1 daughter, age 8. Lives at 4217 Prospect Avenue, apartment 3B. She was terminated last night. Vincenzo was quiet for a moment. The monitor beside him beeped steadily. Terminated. The floor supervisor wrote her up for abandoning her post. Apparently she wasn't authorized to transport patients between floors. She was fired for helping me. Marco didn't answer that. He didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves with the kind of blunt clarity that made commentary unnecessary. What else? Vincenzo asked. No criminal record, no outstanding warrants, credit score in the low 500s. She's drowning in medical debt. Daughter has chronic asthma, severe classification. The kid's been in the ER 6 times in the last 2 years. Vincenzo absorbed this the way he absorbed all intelligence, quickly, completely, without visible reaction. But something behind his eyes shifted. A door that had been sealed for years developed a hairline crack. Send Giancarlo to her address at 9 a.m. Tell him to be respectful. Tell him I want to see her. She might not come. Then she doesn't come. But make sure she knows the invitation is genuine. Marco paused again. Boss, what exactly are you planning? I don't know yet, Vincenzo said. And for the first time in 20 years, he meant it. Imani was standing in her kitchen at 8:45 a.m., staring at her phone screen while the coffee maker gurgled and Zuri sat at the table eating cereal and drawing pictures of horses with a blue crayon when someone knocked on her door. Not the normal knock. Not the hurried knock of the mailman or the aggressive knock of the landlord. This was a single, measured knock followed by silence. the kind of knock that expected to be answered. She looked through the peephole and saw a man she'd never seen before. Mid-30s, olive skin, dark hair cut close, wearing a black suit that didn't come off any rack she'd ever visited. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, feet shoulder-width apart, perfectly still, like a man who'd been trained to wait. "Who is it?" Zuri asked from the table without looking up. "Stay there, baby." Imani opened the door but kept the chain on. "Can I help you? Miss Carter?" The man's voice was polite but carried an accent she couldn't quite place. Italian, maybe, or something adjacent to Italian. "My name is Giancarlo. I work for Mr. DeLuca. He'd like to invite you to see him at the hospital. At your convenience." She stared at him through the 3-inch gap in the door. "He sent someone to my apartment?" "Yes, ma'am." "How did he get my address?" Giancarlo's expression didn't change. "Mr. DeLuca is very resourceful. Mr. DeLuca is in the hospital recovering from a cardiac episode. He shouldn't be sending people anywhere." "I agree with you, ma'am, but I don't make the decisions. I just deliver the messages." Imani looked at him, then past him, down the hallway of her building, water-stained ceiling, carpet worn to threads, the faint smell of cooking grease from the apartment 2 doors down. Behind her, Zuri was humming something, and the coffee maker was finishing its cycle with a dying wheeze. She should have said no. Every practical bone in her body screamed no. You didn't go when men like Vincenzo DeLuca called. You didn't step into their world. You didn't even make eye contact if you could avoid it. But Imani Carter had stopped being practical somewhere around 11 o'clock last night in a basement corridor, and she wasn't sure she could go back. "Tell him I'll come this afternoon," she said, "after I take care of my daughter." Giancarlo nodded once. "Mr. DeLuca will be pleased. A car will be available whenever you're ready." "I'll take the bus." For the first time, something flickered across Giancarlo's face. Not quite surprise. More like recalibration. Like he was updating an internal file. "Of course, ma'am." He left. Imani closed the door and leaned against it. Her heart was doing something uncomfortable against her ribs. Not the panicked hammering of last night, but a slow, heavy thumping that felt like a warning and a dare at the same time. "Mommy, who was that?" Zuri had appeared in the kitchen doorway, blue crayon still in hand, cereal milk on her chin. "Nobody, baby. Just somebody from the hospital." "Are you going back to work?" The question hit Imani right in the center of her chest. She knelt down and wiped the milk from Zuri's chin with her thumb. "Not today. Today we're going to have a good day, okay? You and me." Zuri studied her mother's face with the unsettling perceptiveness that 8-year-olds sometimes possessed. The ability to see through adult performance with a clarity that adults had trained themselves to lose. "Okay, Mommy." Imani kissed her forehead. "Okay." She didn't take the bus. She couldn't afford the bus. What she could afford was the 40-minute walk from Prospect Avenue to St. Mercy Hospital, which she made that afternoon after dropping Zuri at her neighbor's apartment with instructions to call if Zuri started wheezing and a promise to be back before dinner. The walk gave her time to think. Too much time. What did Vincenzo DeLuca want from her? Gratitude? A thank you visit? That didn't track. Men in his position sent flowers and checks, not personal invitations delivered by men in expensive suits. He wanted something specific. And specific, in the world Vincenzo inhabited, usually meant dangerous. But she kept walking, past the bodega on the corner where Mr. Kim sold expired milk at full price, past the laundromat where the dryers ate quarters and gave back damp clothes, past the row of vacant lots that the city had been promising to develop for 15 years and counting, past all of it, through the rain-washed streets of a neighborhood that had been neglected so long it had stopped expecting anything different. St. Mercy looked different in daylight, smaller, more tired. The brick facade was darkened by decades of exhaust, and the emergency entrance was clogged with ambulances and people who looked like they'd been waiting since last night. Imani walked in through the main entrance and headed for the cardiac unit on the 2nd floor. She expected to be stopped. She expected security or a nurse or someone official to ask what she was doing here on her day off, which was now every day off, permanently. Instead, she found Giancarlo standing outside a private room at the end of the hallway, hands clasped in front of him, positioned exactly the way he'd been positioned outside her apartment door, like a man who existed primarily to stand between a certain room and the rest of the world. He nodded when he saw her, opened the door without a word. The room was private, not the semi-private double rooms that regular patients got. This was the kind of room that had its own bathroom, a window with an actual view, and medical equipment that looked like it belonged in a different century than the stuff on the third floor. Fresh flowers on the side table. Real pillows instead of the flat hospital-issue ones that felt like they were stuffed with bad intentions. Vincenzo DeLuca was sitting up in bed. The oxygen cannula was gone, but the IV remained, snaking from the back of his hand to a bag of clear fluid hanging from a metal pole. He'd changed from the hospital gown into a dark shirt, which told Imani that someone had brought him clothes from home because men like Vincenzo DeLuca did not tolerate hospital gowns any longer than absolutely necessary. He looked better than last night, still pale, still carrying that grayish undertone, but his eyes were clear and focused, and they found her the moment she walked through the door. "You came," he said. "You sent a man to my house at 9 in the morning. I figured you weren't going to stop until I showed up." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like the memory of what a smile used to feel like before he'd stopped using them. "Sit down." She looked at the chair beside his bed, then back at him. "I'll stand." Another flicker of that almost smile. "Fair enough." Silence. The monitor beeped. Rain had started again, lighter this time, tapping against the window like it was asking permission to come in. "You lost your job because of me," Vincenzo said. "I lost my job because of a floor supervisor with a notebook and a power trip. You were just the excuse. Still, it happened because you helped me. It happened because I did my job. The fact that my job doesn't want me doing it is the hospital's problem." He studied her. That same assessing gaze from the corridor last night, but calmer now, less clouded by pain. She felt it like a physical thing, like being x-rayed by someone who could read the results in real time. "I want to offer you something," he said. "I don't need your money. I'm not offering money." He paused, adjusted the IV line at the back of his hand with the careful attention of a man who was used to controlling every element of his environment, even the medical ones. "I'm offering a position." Imani waited. "I need someone," he said slowly, choosing each word with the precision of a man assembling a weapon, "who isn't afraid to tell me the truth. I have an organization full of people who tell me what I want to hear, lawyers who say what I pay them to say, associates who agree with every decision I make because disagreeing isn't safe. I don't need more of that. I need someone who'll look me in the face and tell me when I'm wrong. You barely know me. You told me to stop arguing and breathe in an elevator while I was dying." He let that hang in the air. "I haven't met anyone that direct in 20 years. That's not a job qualification. That's a personality trait. In my world, it's both." She crossed her arms, felt her weight settle into her heels. Behind her, she could hear Giancarlo's breathing on the other side of the closed door. Steady, patient, professional. What exactly would I be doing? Managing my schedule, coordinating with my legal team, handling community relations for some of my development projects. Things that require someone who can communicate with normal people because, frankly, I've forgotten how. You want me to be your assistant. I want you to be the person who keeps me connected to the world outside this empire, because I've been disconnected from it for a very long time, and it's starting to cost me." Imani looked at him, really looked, past the suit and the hospital room and the IV and the name that made people cross the street. She looked at the man underneath all of it and saw something she recognized, the specific kind of exhaustion that came from carrying everything alone for too long. She knew that exhaustion. She lived in it. "I have a daughter," she said. "She's 8. She has severe asthma, and she needs me. Whatever this is, she comes first, always. No exceptions." "Understood. I'm not going to lie for you. I'm not going to cover up anything illegal. I'm not going to pretend I don't see what I see. I wouldn't expect you to. And I'm not going to call you boss, or sir, or whatever your people call you. My name is Imani, and your name is Vincenzo, and we're going to be adults about this." Something happened in his face then. Something subtle and enormous and completely unguarded. For one fraction of a second, the armor dropped, and she saw what was underneath. A man so lonely that the simple act of someone speaking to him like a human being registered as a shock to his system. Then the armor came back. But the crack remained. When can you start? He asked. When can you get out of this hospital? Tomorrow. Then tomorrow. She left, walked back down the corridor, past Giancarlo, past the nurses' station where the staff carefully avoided eye contact, out through the lobby and into the rain. Halfway home, she stopped on the sidewalk outside the laundromat with the broken dryers and put her hands on her knees and breathed. Just breathed, the way she'd told him to breathe in the elevator. What had she just done? She'd just agreed to walk into the center of the most dangerous organization in the city, armed with nothing but her mouth and her stubbornness and the desperate need to keep her daughter alive. She straightened up, wiped the rain from her face, and kept walking. Because Imani Carter didn't stop. Not for storms. Not for supervisors with notebooks. Not for the cold, calculating gravity of men who ruled from shadows. She didn't stop for anything. But 3 miles away, in his hospital bed, Vincenzo DeLuca was staring at the door she'd walked through and feeling something he hadn't felt in 7 years. His chest ached, not from the arrhythmia, not from the medication, from something far more dangerous. And for the first time since Sophia died, the most feared man in the city was afraid. Not of enemies, not of federal agents, not of the rivals circling his empire like wolves around a wounded elk. He was afraid because a woman in broken shoes had looked him in the eye and spoken to him like he was just a man. And he had no idea what to do with that. His phone rang. Marco. The background check is complete, Marco said. She's clean, no connections to any organization, no debts to anyone in our world, no leverage points. Good. Vincenzo. Marco used his first name, which meant the next words were personal, not professional. The capos are going to talk. You hire a woman nobody's ever heard of, a black woman from Prospect Avenue, and put her inside the operation. They're going to see it as weakness. Let them. I'm serious. Carmine's already asking questions. Sal's been on the phone with his people all morning. This kind of move creates instability. Then let it create instability. I've spent 30 years building something stable, and it's killing me. Maybe instability is exactly what I need. Marco was quiet for a long time. The monitor beeped. The rain fell. You're different, Marco said finally. I almost died last night, Marco. In an elevator in a hospital that smells like bleach and failure, with a woman I'd never met holding my hand. So yes, I'm different. He hung up, set the phone on his chest, stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, everything would change. He just didn't know yet how much. And across the city, in a cramped apartment on Prospect Avenue, Imani Carter was sitting on the edge of her bed watching her daughter sleep, listening to the sound of Zuri's breathing through the quiet dark, and making a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. That she would walk into Vincenzo DeLuca's world, that she would survive it, and that no matter what happened, no matter how deep the shadows got, no matter how loud the violence became, no matter what the most dangerous man in the city asked of her, she would come home to this bed and this child and this life. Every single night. The inhaler on the nightstand caught the glow of the butterfly nightlight, half empty. 12 days until rent was due. Imani closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she didn't calculate. She just breathed. The first morning Imani walked into the DeLuca compound, she almost turned around twice. The compound wasn't a house. It wasn't even an estate. It was a fortress disguised as architecture. A sprawling stone and glass property on the north side of the city, set back from the road behind wrought iron gates, and a quarter-mile of private driveway lined with cameras she could see and cameras she knew she couldn't. The main building looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that beauty and intimidation were the same thing if you applied them correctly. 3 stories of dark stone, floor-to-ceiling windows tinted so nothing was visible from outside, and a front entrance flanked by 2 men in dark suits who stood so still they could have been carved from the same stone as the walls. Giancarlo drove her. She'd refused the car the first time, but after Vincenzo pointed out that arriving at his compound by public bus would take 90 minutes and require 2 transfers, she'd accepted the ride with the specific reluctance of a woman who understood that every convenience came with a string attached. The interior was worse than the exterior, worse because it was beautiful in a way that felt aggressive. Marble floors so polished they reflected the ceiling, a staircase that curved upward like the spine of some enormous sleeping animal. Art on the walls that Imani didn't recognize but understood instinctively cost more than her entire apartment building. And everywhere, the quiet. Not peaceful quiet. controlled quiet. The kind of silence that happened when every sound was monitored and every whisper was recorded and every footstep landed on surfaces designed to announce your presence before you arrived. She followed Giancarlo through a corridor, past a kitchen larger than her apartment, past a room with leather furniture and a bar that looked like it had never been used for anything casual, and into an office at the back of the first floor. Vincenzo was already there, sitting behind a desk the size of a small car, wearing a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, reading something on a tablet with the focused intensity of a man who processed information the way other people processed oxygen, continuously and without apparent effort. He looked up when she entered. The color had returned to his face since the hospital, but the grayish undertone lingered at the edges, like a stain that wouldn't fully wash out. His left hand rested on the desk with the IV bruise still visible, a small purple bloom on the back of his hand that he made no effort to hide. "You're early," he said. "I'm on time. Your driver was early." "Giancarlo is always early. It's how he stays alive." She set her bag, a canvas tote with a broken zipper that she'd been meaning to replace for 6 months, on the chair across from his desk and looked around the office. Bookshelves lined 2 walls. A window behind him overlooked what appeared to be a private courtyard with manicured hedges and a fountain that wasn't running. On the desk, beside the tablet, sat 3 phones arranged in a precise row and a glass of water that hadn't been touched. "Where do I work?" she asked. He gestured toward a door to his left. She opened it and found a smaller office, still larger than any room in her apartment, with a desk, a computer, a phone, and a window facing the front driveway. The desk was empty except for a single folder. "That's your schedule for the week," Vincenzo said from behind her. "Read it, memorize it, then come find me and tell me everything that's wrong with it." "Why would anything be wrong with it?" "Because my previous assistant built it, and my previous assistant was a yes man who scheduled meetings based on what I wanted to hear rather than what I needed to do. I fired him 3 months ago, and I've been running on chaos since." Imani picked up the folder, opened it, scanned the first page. "You have a meeting with someone named Carmine at 10, a lunch with your legal team at 12:30, and a call with your accountant at 3, she said. "That's Tuesday. Wednesday is blank. Thursday has 7 meetings stacked back-to-back with no breaks. Friday says TBD for every slot." She looked up. "This isn't a schedule. This is a cry for help." That almost smile again, the ghost of something human moving beneath the surface of his face like a fish beneath ice. "Fix it," he said. She sat down at her desk and started working. The first week was orientation through immersion. Nobody gave her a handbook or a training manual because handbooks and training manuals implied a level of organizational transparency that the DeLuca empire did not practice. Instead, Imani learned by watching, listening, and asking questions that made people uncomfortable. She learned that the compound housed Vincenzo's primary operations on the first floor, private quarters on the second, and a series of rooms on the third that she was told were storage by 3 different people who all avoided eye contact when they said it. She learned that Marco Bianchi, the consigliere, ran the day-to-day operations with the efficiency of a machine and the warmth of a refrigerator. She learned that Giancarlo was not just a driver, but the head of Vincenzo's personal security detail, a position that apparently required the ability to stand motionless for hours while remaining capable of lethal action at a moment's notice. And she learned about the capos. There were 4 of them, each controlling a section of the DeLuca organization. Carmine Ferraro ran the nightclubs. Sal Mancuso handled the ports. A woman named Elena Vitale managed the financial operations, the legitimate ones and the ones that pretended to be legitimate. And a man named Dominic Russo oversaw what was euphemistically called security, which Imani understood to mean the part of the empire that kept people afraid. Carmine was the problem. She knew it within 2 days. Not because anyone told her, nobody told her anything directly. Everything came in fragments and implications. But because Carmine Ferraro looked at her the way you'd look at a stain on an expensive suit, with disgust that was personal and contempt that was structural. He was 53, thick through the chest and neck, with hands like slabs of pale meat and eyes that sat too deep in his skull, giving his face a permanent expression of suspicion. He'd been with the DeLuca family for 27 years, longer than anyone except Marco, and he carried that seniority like a weapon, reminding everyone in every room exactly how long he'd been loyal and exactly how much that loyalty had cost him. The first time he spoke to Imani directly was on her third day. She was in the main corridor carrying a stack of folders to Vincenzo's office when Carmine stepped out of a side room and blocked her path. Not aggressively, just physically, filling the space the way large men filled spaces, by existing in them with enough mass to make movement around them feel like a concession. "You're the hospital girl," he said. "I'm Imani Carter. I work for Vincenzo. You push wheelchairs. I pushed one wheelchair. Now I manage schedules. People change careers." He didn't move. His eyes tracked down her body and back up with a slowness that was designed to communicate something specific, that he was assessing her and finding her insufficient, that her presence in this building was a temporary error he intended to correct. "You know what happens to people who get close to Vincenzo?" Carmine said. "They get used up. Every single one. The last assistant lasted 8 months before he burned out and disappeared. The one before that made it 5. Before that," he shrugged, "I lose count." "Thanks for the pep talk." "It's not a pep talk. It's arithmetic. You're a variable that doesn't fit the equation, and variables that don't fit get eliminated. That's not a threat. That's how math works. I was always better at English anyway." She stepped around him and kept walking. Her hands were steady on the folders, but her pulse was hammering in her neck hard enough that she could feel it behind her ears. She didn't look back because looking back would mean she was checking whether he was following, and checking meant she was afraid. And afraid was a luxury she refused to carry in this building. She told Vincenzo about the encounter that afternoon. They were in his office. He was reviewing contracts at his desk while she sat across from him with the reorganized schedule she'd built from scratch over the past 2 days. She'd restructured his entire week, consolidated the redundant legal meetings, created buffer time between high-stress appointments, blocked off a daily window that she labeled thinking time, and he called staring at the wall, and moved his Friday meetings to Thursday so he'd have 1 day a week without anyone demanding anything from him. Carmine introduced himself, she said, not looking up from the schedule printout. Vincenzo turned a page. "What did he say?" "He told me I'm a variable that doesn't fit the equation." "What did you say?" "That I was better at English." Vincenzo set down the contract, looked at her. His eyes had that quality again, the stillness of deep water, revealing nothing about what moved beneath the surface. "Carmine has been questioning my decision since before you were born," he said. "He questioned my expansion into the ports. He questioned my move into real estate. He questioned my decision to keep the family out of narcotics when every other organization was making millions from it. Every time, he was wrong, and every time, he found someone else to blame for being wrong. So he's going to blame me. He's going to try. And what happens when he does?" Vincenzo picked up the contract again. "That depends entirely on you." She understood what he wasn't saying. He wasn't going to protect her from Carmine, not because he didn't care, but because protection in this world was a form of ownership, and whatever Vincenzo wanted from Imani, it wasn't that. He wanted her to stand on her own, inside his world, but not behind him. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it sharpened something inside her chest, a blade of clarity that cut through the fear and left behind a clean, cold anger. She could do this. Not because she was brave, because she'd spent 31 years surviving men who underestimated her, and Carmine Ferraro was just the latest in a line that stretched back to her earliest memories. By the end of the second week, Imani had reorganized Vincenzo's communication system, created a filing structure that actually made sense, and alienated approximately 60% of his inner circle. The alienation wasn't intentional. Or maybe it was. She wasn't sure anymore. The problem was simple. Imani asked questions, direct questions. Questions that people in this world weren't accustomed to hearing from someone who'd been there for 14 days and arrived carrying a canvas tote with a broken zipper. When Sal Mancuso submitted expense reports for the port operations with numbers that didn't add up, she flagged them. When Elena Vitale scheduled a financial review and then canceled it 3 times in a row, she asked why. When Dominic Russo's security team requested approval for equipment purchases listed only as miscellaneous tactical supplies, she asked for specifics. Each question, by itself, was reasonable. Together, they formed a pattern that the capos recognized immediately. Someone was actually paying attention. Marco pulled her aside after the second week. They stood in the corridor outside Vincenzo's office, speaking in the low tones that everyone in this building used, as though the walls themselves were listening, which, Imani suspected, they were. "You're making enemies," Marco said. He was a lean man, late 40s, with gray at his temples, and the careful diction of someone who'd learned English as a second language and mastered it better than most native speakers. His suits were dark and conservative, his shoes were always polished, and his face carried the permanent expression of a man performing calculations that other people couldn't see. "I'm doing my job." "Your job is to manage Vincenzo's schedule." "My job is to be the person who tells him the truth." Those are his words, not mine. There's a difference between telling the truth and interrogating people who've been part of this organization for decades. If their numbers added up, there'd be nothing to interrogate. Marco's jaw tightened. She watched the muscle work beneath his skin, a small, involuntary motion that told her more than his words did. "I'm not your enemy, Imani." "I didn't say you were. But I'm also not going to shield you from the consequences of pushing too hard too fast. This organization has rhythms, protocols, ways of doing things that existed long before you arrived and will exist long after you leave." "If." Marco blinked. "Excuse me?" "Long after I leave." "You said after. The word you should have used is if." She walked away. Her shoes, new ones, bought with the first paycheck Vincenzo had deposited into her account, an amount so large she'd checked the number 3 times, clicked against the marble with a sound that was sharper than the squeak of her old hospital shoes. Behind her, Marco stood in the corridor and watched her go with an expression that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite concern. It was recognition. He'd seen this before. Someone new enters Vincenzo's orbit, burns bright, challenges everything, refuses to bend. He'd seen it before, and he'd seen how it ended. It always ended the same way, with blood. The first month turned into 2, 2 turned into 3, and somewhere in the middle of those weeks, something happened that nobody expected. Vincenzo DeLuca started changing. Not dramatically, not obviously. The changes were small, the kind of shifts that only someone watching closely would notice. He started leaving his office before 7 p.m., when previously he'd worked until midnight. He began eating meals at a table instead of at his desk. He asked about Zuri, not once, not as a courtesy, but regularly, with a genuine interest that manifested in questions about her school and her asthma and the drawings she made with those blue crayons. Then one evening, Vincenzo did something that sent a shockwave through the entire organization. He brought Zuri into the compound. Imani had been called in for an emergency schedule restructure. 3 meetings had collided and a conference call with their European partners couldn't be moved. And her neighbor, who usually watched Zuri, was unavailable. She'd apologized, explained the situation, and offered to work from home. Vincenzo had said, "Bring her." Zuri Carter, 8 years old, 4 feet 2 inches of energy and curiosity and absolute fearlessness, walked into the DeLuca compound carrying a backpack full of crayons and a stuffed elephant named Gerald, and proceeded to do what no federal investigation, no rival family, and no internal power struggle had ever accomplished. She made Vincenzo DeLuca laugh. It happened in his office. Imani was on the phone with the European team, sorting out time zones and agenda conflicts, and Zuri was supposed to be drawing quietly at the small table in Imani's office. Instead, she'd wandered through the connecting door into Vincenzo's space, climbed into the chair across from his desk, and started drawing. When Imani finished her call and rushed in to retrieve her daughter, she found Vincenzo leaning across his desk, studying Zuri's drawing with the focused intensity he usually reserved for financial projections. "That's a dragon," Zuri was explaining, "but it's a nice dragon. It only burns things that are mean." "What determines if something is mean?" "The dragon decides." "That's a lot of power for one dragon." "It's a very responsible dragon." Vincenzo looked up at Imani, and the expression on his face, she'd never seen it before. Not in the hospital, not in his office, not in any of the hundreds of interactions they'd had over the past 3 months. It was soft, unguarded, bewildered, like a man who'd forgotten what warmth felt like and was now standing too close to a fire, unsure whether to step forward or back. "She can stay," he said. After that, Zuri came to the compound regularly. Not every day, but often enough that she had her own corner in Vincenzo's office, with a small desk, art supplies, and a growing collection of picture books that appeared on the shelves without explanation. Vincenzo, the man who had ordered violence without blinking for 3 decades, now spent portions of his evening helping an 8-year-old with her homework. He learned the names of her teachers. He learned which crayon colors she preferred. He learned, after one memorable attempt that produced something so misshapen, Zuri laughed until she choked, how to braid a doll's hair. It was this, not the schedule reorganization, not the questions about expense reports, not even Imani's relentless refusal to be intimidated, that finally pushed Carmine Ferraro to act. It happened on a Thursday. Vincenzo was in his office with Zuri, reviewing flashcards for a spelling test, when Carmine walked in without knocking. Behind him stood Sal Mancuso and 2 associates that Imani didn't recognize, broad men with flat eyes and hands that hung at their sides with the practiced stillness of men accustomed to reaching for things quickly. Imani was at her desk in the adjoining office. She heard the door open and Carmine's voice, and something in the tone, a hardness that went beyond his usual contempt, made her stand up and move to the doorway. "We need to talk," Carmine said. He wasn't looking at Vincenzo. He was looking at Zuri, who had stopped mid-flashcard and was staring at the group of men with wide eyes. Alone, Vincenzo set down the flashcards. His movement was slow, deliberate, the careful repositioning of a man who understood that speed was a form of panic, and panic was a form of weakness. He looked at Carmine, then at Sal, then at the 2 men behind them. "Zuri," he said quietly, "go to Imani's office, please." Zuri looked at him, then at the men, then back at Vincenzo with an expression that was too old for her face. The look of a child who understood that the room had changed temperature and the adults were pretending it hadn't. "Okay," she said. She gathered her flashcards, tucked Gerald under her arm, and walked past Carmine without looking at him. Imani met her at the doorway, placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, and guided her into the other office. Then Imani stayed in the doorway. Carmine noticed, "This is private." "Then you should have scheduled a private meeting," Imani said. "Through me, the way it works now." Carmine's face darkened. He turned to Vincenzo with the expression of a man presenting evidence in a case he'd already won. This is what I'm talking about." "Say what you came to say, Carmine." "The Morettis hit 2 of our distribution points last night. Product worth $300,000 disappeared from the East Side warehouse. The Port Authority is asking questions about the container shipments from last month, and the Federal Task Force has a new prosecutor, a woman named Chen, who's been subpoenaing financial records from every business connected to our name." Carmine planted his hands on the desk. "And you're in here doing flashcards?" The room went very still. Vincenzo didn't move, didn't blink. His hands remained flat on the desk beside the scattered flashcards, and his face settled into an expression Imani had never seen before, the expression that existed beneath the almost smiles and the quiet voice and the man who braided doll's hair. This was the other face, the one that had built the empire, the one that people feared. "Are you finished?" Vincenzo said. "I'm just getting started. The capos have been talking, Vincenzo. All of us. We've been patient. We've watched you bring an outsider into the organization, give her access to schedules and communications and financial documents. She's my assistant. She's a liability. And the kid? Bringing a child into compound operations? Do you understand what that looks like? Do you understand what message that sends to the Morettis, to Chen, to every associate and soldier in our organization who's wondering whether the boss has lost his grip?" Sal spoke for the first time. He was quieter than Carmine, thinner, with a face built for shadows and a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere deeper than his chest. "We're not questioning your leadership, Vincenzo. We're questioning your focus." "My focus?" "You've been distracted. We all see it. The schedule changes, the reduced hours, the development project negotiations. You're spending time and resources on things that don't serve the family." Vincenzo looked at Sal, then at Carmine, then at the 2 men standing behind them who hadn't moved or spoken, but whose presence communicated everything that words didn't. "Get out," Vincenzo said. Carmine straightened. "Vincenzo, I said get out, all of you, now." They left. Carmine laughed, pausing at the door long enough to look back at Vincenzo with an expression that contained something Imani hadn't seen before. Not anger, calculation. The look of a man measuring the distance between loyalty and opportunity and finding the gap narrower than expected. When they were gone, Vincenzo sat motionless at his desk for a long time. The flashcards lay scattered between his hands. Gerald the elephant sat in Zuri's empty chair, leaning sideways with his one good ear drooping. Imani stepped into the office. "How much of that was true?" she asked. "All of it. The Morettis, the prosecutor, the warehouse. All of it." He looked up at her. The other face was gone. What remained was something raw. The face of a man standing at a crossroads and realizing that every path led somewhere he didn't want to go. "Carmine's right about one thing. I've been distracted. I've been letting things slide because for the first time in years, I can breathe in this building, and breathing makes you slow. Breathing keeps you alive. In this world, those aren't the same thing." She sat down across from him. Not in the chair where Zuri had been sitting. That felt wrong somehow. But in the other one, the one the capos used, the one that still carried the faint impression of Carmine's weight. "What are you going to do?" He didn't answer for a long time. Outside, the sun was setting behind the courtyard, turning the fountain's dry basin gold. And somewhere in the building, a door closed with that heavy, final sound. "The Southside Development Project," he said. "The one we've been negotiating for 6 months. The community board is meeting next week. They're going to reject the proposal." "Why?" "Because they see me as a criminal trying to gentrify their neighborhood, and they're not entirely wrong." "What does the project mean to you?" He looked at her then with an intensity that pinned her to the chair. "It's the neighborhood I grew up in. Before all of this. Before the family, the organization, the empire. My father ran a grocery store on the corner of 10th and Maple. He gave away more food than he sold because the families on that block couldn't afford to pay, and he couldn't afford to watch them go hungry." He paused. "They tore that building down 15 years ago, put up a parking structure. I bought the entire block last year." "To do what?" "I don't know. That's the problem. I bought it because losing it felt unbearable, but I don't have a plan that the community would trust because they shouldn't trust me. My name means something different on those streets than it does in this office." Imani watched him, saw the conflict moving across his face like weather, the ambition fighting the grief, fighting the guilt, fighting something newer and less defined, something that looked almost like hope. "Go talk to them," she said. "What?" "The community board, the meeting next week. Don't send lawyers, don't send Marco, don't send a presentation. Go yourself. Walk in there as Vincenzo DeLuca from 10th and Maple, not as the head of the DeLuca family, and talk to the people who live on those streets." He stared at her. "You want me to walk into a room full of people who hate my name? I want you to walk into a room full of people who knew your father." The words landed somewhere deep. She watched the impact ripple through him, a flinch he couldn't hide, a tremor in the muscle at the corner of his jaw, a slight widening of his eyes that lasted half a second before the armor clamped back down. "They'll eat me alive. Maybe. Or maybe you'll say something real for the first time in 30 years. And it'll matter. You're asking me to be vulnerable in front of strangers. I'm asking you to be human in front of neighbors." Silence. The office settled around them. Somewhere above, Zuri's footsteps moved across the floor of the room she'd been given. Light, quick, the sound of a child who had no idea that the world she'd wandered into was held together by threats and calculation and the specific kind of loyalty that looked a lot like fear. "Will you come with me?" Vincenzo asked. "Yes." "Why?" She met his eyes, held them. "Because somebody has to make sure you actually do it." He looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up Gerald the elephant from Zuri's chair and set it on his desk, adjusting the drooping ear with fingers that had signed orders for violence, that had gripped the armrest of a wheelchair in a dark elevator, that had once held his dying wife's hand until the warmth left it. "Next Thursday," he said. "The meeting is at 7 p.m., Southside Community Center on 12th Street. I'll clear your schedule. Clear Carmine's too. He doesn't need to know about this." Imani stood, walked toward the door, stopped. "Vincenzo." "Yes?" "When you go into that room, they're going to ask you what you're willing to give up. Not what you're willing to build, what you're willing to lose. You need to have an answer for that. She left. Vincenzo sat alone in his office with a stuffed elephant and a stack of flashcards, and the growing certainty that Thursday night would change everything, either by saving him or by finishing what that elevator had started. Outside, the sun disappeared behind the city skyline, and the compound filled with shadows that moved like living things, sliding across the marble floors and pooling in corners where the cameras couldn't reach. And in a dark room on the third floor, the one they called storage, the one nobody talked about, Carmine Ferraro sat across from Sal Mancuso and spoke 3 words into a silence that smelled like cigarette smoke and betrayal. Thursday night, we move. Thursday came wearing fog, the kind of thick, wet fog that rolled off the river and swallowed entire blocks of the south side, turning streetlights into pale smudges, and making every alley look like it opened into nothing. Imani watched it from the window of the SUV as Giancarlo drove them through streets she recognized from a different life. Streets where she'd walked to school as a kid, where her mother had worked double shifts at the dry cleaner on 8th Street, where the corner stores still had bulletproof glass between the cashier and the customer because trust was a luxury this neighborhood had never been able to afford. Vincenzo sat beside her in the back seat. He'd changed clothes 3 times before leaving the compound, which she knew because Giancarlo had mentioned it with the flat, uninflected delivery of a man reporting intelligence. First the charcoal suit, then a darker one, then finally what he was wearing now. Dark slacks, a simple black shirt open at the collar, no tie, no cufflinks, no watch, stripped of his usual armor. He looked almost ordinary, and the effort it took to achieve that ordinariness told Imani more about his state of mind than anything he'd said during the drive. He hadn't said much. A few words about the weather, a question about whether Zuri had eaten dinner. Then silence, the kind that pressed against the inside of the car like something with weight. "You're nervous," she said. "I don't get nervous." "Your right hand has been tapping against your thigh since we passed 9th Street. That's nervous." He looked down at his hand, stopped the tapping, curled his fingers into his palm. "I haven't been to this neighborhood in 14 years, he said. "Last time I came, I was buying property through a shell corporation. I sat in a car just like this one, on a street just like this one, and signed papers that displaced 43 families." He paused. "I didn't know the number then. I looked it up last night." "Why last night?" "Because you told me they'd ask what I was willing to give up. I needed to know what I'd already taken." The Southside Community Center was a squat brick building on 12th Street, wedged between a laundromat and an empty lot where someone had planted tomatoes and old tire rims. The parking lot held maybe 20 cars, and the front steps were crowded with people smoking and talking in clusters that went quiet when the black SUV pulled up. Giancarlo stopped the car, looked in the rearview mirror. "I count 30, maybe 35 people outside," he said. "I can have 2 men at the door in 4 minutes." "No," Vincenzo said. "Boss, no guards, no men, just me and Imani." Giancarlo's jaw worked. He didn't argue. Arguing with Vincenzo was something other people did, not him, but his disapproval filled the car like a physical temperature. They got out. The fog wrapped around them immediately, damp and cool against Imani's skin. She could feel the people on the steps watching them. 35 sets of eyes tracking the man in the black shirt and the woman beside him with the particular intensity that came from recognizing a name before recognizing a face. Someone whispered. Someone else didn't bother whispering. "That's DeLuca." Vincenzo heard it. She saw his shoulders tighten, a subtle gathering of muscle beneath the fabric of his shirt, the instinctive response of a man who'd spent decades interpreting whispers as threats. "Keep walking," she said quietly. They walked inside. The community center's main room smelled like old coffee and floor wax, and the specific kind of desperation that collected in places where people came to fight for things they shouldn't have had to fight for. Metal folding chairs were arranged in uneven rows facing a table at the front, where 3 community board members sat with papers and water bottles, and the exhausted expressions of volunteers who'd been doing this work too long with too little support. The room was packed, maybe 100 people, filling every chair and lining the walls and spilling into the hallway. Imani recognized the demographics instantly. Working class, mostly Black and Latino. A few older white residents who'd been in the neighborhood since before the decay set in. People who worked 2 jobs and took the bus and knew the names of each other's kids. People who had everything to lose and no margin left for losing. When Vincenzo walked in, the room didn't just go quiet. It went hostile. The silence had texture, sharp, compressed, vibrating with the accumulated anger of people who'd watched their neighborhood get carved up by men in expensive cars for decades. The board chair, a heavy-set black woman in her 60s named Dorothy Price, looked up from her papers and fixed Vincenzo with a stare that could have stripped paint. "Mr. DeLuca," she said, "we weren't expecting you personally." "I know. I should have come sooner." "You should have come 14 years ago, before your company bought half our block and turned it into parking structures." A murmur ran through the crowd. Not approval, exactly. Recognition. The sound of people hearing their own anger spoken aloud by someone authorized to speak it. Vincenzo stood at the front of the room. No podium. No notes. No buffer between him and 100 people who had every reason to hate him. "You're right," he said. The murmur shifted, became something uncertain. "I grew up 6 blocks from here," he continued. His voice was different than Imani had ever heard it. Lower, rougher, stripped of the controlled precision he used in the compound. This was a voice that remembered something older than power. "My father ran a grocery store on the corner of 10th and Maple. Small place, green awning. He couldn't afford to stock the shelves most weeks, so he filled the gaps with whatever he could find. Dented cans, day-old bread, produce from the wholesale market that nobody else wanted." Silence. But different now. The hostile edge was softening into something cautious, provisional, like an animal deciding whether to flee or approach. "He gave food away," Vincenzo said, "to families on this block who couldn't pay. He kept a notebook behind the register, a ledger of debts that he never collected. When he died, my mother found that notebook. Every page was full, 30 years of debts that people owed him." He paused. "She burned it, said those debts belonged to the neighborhood, not to us." A woman in the 3rd row, elderly, thin, with silver hair pulled tight beneath a blue headscarf, leaned forward in her chair. "I remember that store," she said. Her voice was papery and quiet, but it carried through the room like smoke. "Your father's name was Enzo. He used to give my boys peppermints when they came in after school." Vincenzo looked at her, and something in his face cracked. Not broke, cracked. A hairline fracture running through the armor, visible only to someone watching closely. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Peppermints. He bought them in bulk from a distributor in Jersey, the cheap ones that stuck to the wrapper." The woman smiled. It was a small smile, cautious, but it changed the temperature of the entire room by 2 degrees. Then Dorothy Price brought the temperature back down. "That's a nice story, Mr. DeLuca, but your father's grocery store doesn't explain why your development company wants to demolish the community garden on Maple Street and build luxury condominiums. That garden feeds 60 families. My grandchildren play there. So with all respect to your father's peppermints, what exactly are you here to tell us?" Vincenzo looked at her, then at the room, then at Imani, who was standing against the wall near the back, arms crossed, watching him with an expression that said, "This is the moment. Don't waste it." "The garden stays," he said. Dorothy blinked. The room shifted. "The garden stays," he repeated. "The condominiums are canceled. I'm replacing them with affordable housing, 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom units, rent capped at 30% of area median income for the first 20 years. The community garden gets expanded, not demolished. And the old lot on 10th where my father's store used to be. I'm donating it to the neighborhood, free and clear. You decide what goes there." The room erupted. Not into applause. These were people too experienced with broken promises to applaud words. But into noise. Questions layered over objections, layered over cautious hope, layered over deep structural distrust. Dorothy was leaning forward, demanding specifics. A young man in the 4th row was asking about construction jobs. An older woman wanted to know about the timeline. A teenager in the back was filming on his phone. Vincenzo answered everything. Not smoothly, not like a politician or a developer. He stumbled over numbers, corrected himself, admitted when he didn't have an answer and promised to get one. He was imperfect and unpolished and visibly uncomfortable, and somehow that made him more credible than any presentation his lawyers could have prepared. For 45 minutes, the most feared man in the city stood in a room full of strangers and let them question him, challenge him, doubt him, and demand more from him. And he took every bit of it. Imani watched from the back of the room and felt something dangerous expanding inside her chest. Something that felt like admiration, which was bad enough. But beneath the admiration was something worse. Tenderness. She crushed it, pressed it down into the place where she kept all the things she couldn't afford to feel. But it didn't disappear. It just went quiet, waiting. The meeting ended at 8:45. People filed out slowly, some shaking Vincenzo's hand, others just nodding, a few still openly suspicious but willing to wait and see. Dorothy Price told him she'd hold him to every promise, and he said he expected nothing less. They walked outside into the fog. The parking lot had emptied. Streetlights made pale circles on the wet asphalt. Giancarlo was standing beside the SUV with his phone pressed to his ear and an expression on his face that Imani had never seen before. Fear. "Get in the car," Giancarlo said. He wasn't asking. "Now." Vincenzo stopped walking. "What happened?" "Carmine. He moved tonight while you were in there. He's taken the East Side warehouse, the port office, and the financial server room at the secondary compound. Sal's with him. Half the soldiers on the night rotation switched sides. Marco's at the main compound with whoever's still loyal, but he says it's maybe 30%. The words hit the air like gunshots. Imani felt each one land in her chest. Warehouse, port, server room, switched sides, and watched Vincenzo's face undergo a transformation that took less than 2 seconds but covered a distance of 30 years. The man who'd stood in the community center, stumbling and imperfect and human, disappeared. What replaced him was something older and colder and built for exactly this moment. His spine straightened, his jaw set. His eyes went flat and dark, like someone had switched off the light behind them and left only the machinery running. "How many men does Carmine have?" His voice was ice on steel. "Giancarlo estimates 60, maybe 70, including Sal's port crew." "And Marco?" 25 at best, maybe 30 if the day shift guys come in." "Elena?" "Unreachable. Her phone's off. Could mean she's with Carmine or could mean she's running." Vincenzo stood in the parking lot of the Southside Community Center with fog swirling around his ankles and the ruins of his empire collapsing in real time. He'd spent the evening giving away condominiums and donating land and being human. And while he was being human, the wolves had moved. Carmine had timed it perfectly. The one night Vincenzo went in without guards, without soldiers, without the infrastructure of threat that kept the empire standing. The one night he chose vulnerability over control. And Carmine had used that vulnerability like a blade, cutting through the organization's loyalty structure with surgical precision while the boss was busy remembering his father's peppermints. "Get Imani home," Vincenzo said. "No." The word came out of Imani's mouth before she'd decided to say it. He turned to her. "This isn't your fight. You just stood in that room for 45 minutes being the man I told you to be. Don't you dare turn back into the other one and shut me out. Imani, people are going to get hurt tonight, possibly killed. I need you and Zuri as far from this as possible." "And then what? You go to the compound and do what? Start a war with 60 men and 30 soldiers? You'll be dead before midnight. That's my problem. It stopped being just your problem the day you hired me." They stared at each other across the wet asphalt. Fog drifted between them. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. Giancarlo's phone rang. He answered, listened for 10 seconds, and his face went white. "Boss?" His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Marco says Carmine just made a call to the Moretti family. He's offering them the port operations in exchange for backup. If the Morettis come in, we're looking at over 100 men." Vincenzo closed his eyes. Just for a moment. When he opened them, something had shifted in the darkness behind his irises. A decision made, a line crossed, a door closed so permanently that the sound of it seemed to echo off the wet pavement and the fog in the walls of the community center where, less than an hour ago, he'd been the closest thing to a good man he'd managed in 30 years. "Call everyone," Vincenzo said. "Every soldier, every associate, every person who owes the DeLuca name anything. Tonight we find out who's real." He turned to Imani. His face was a mask, but his eyes held something that the mask couldn't fully contain. A terrible, desperate sadness, the kind that came from watching a version of yourself die in real time. "Go home," he said. "Lock the door. Don't answer the phone unless it's me." Vincenzo, please. The word was broken glass in his mouth. If anything happens to you or Zuri because of what I am, I will never recover from it. Do you understand? I have survived everything this world has thrown at me. Bullets, betrayal, prison, burying my wife. But I will not survive that. She looked at him. Rain was starting to mix with the fog, fine droplets that clung to his hair and his eyelashes and the collar of his simple black shirt. He looked nothing like a mafia boss. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something bottomless and asking the only person he trusted to step back before the ground gave way. She got in the car. Giancarlo drove her home in silence. The city blurred past the windows, streetlights and storefronts and the dark shapes of buildings that looked like they were holding their breath. At her apartment, she found Zuri asleep with Gerald the elephant and a half-finished drawing on the nightstand. The drawing showed 3 people standing in front of a house: a woman, a little girl, and a tall man with dark hair. Imani sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the drawing and listened to her daughter breathe and felt the full weight of what was happening settle onto her shoulders like a physical load. She'd told Vincenzo to be human. She'd pushed him toward vulnerability and openness and the terrifying act of standing unarmed in front of people who had every reason to hate him. And while he was doing exactly what she asked, the empire had turned on itself like a snake eating its own tail. And now the man who'd braided Doll's hair and helped with flashcards was driving toward a war that might kill him before morning. Her phone sat on the nightstand beside the inhaler. Silent, dark. She picked it up, put it down, picked it up again. Then the screen lit up with a text from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words. Compound is surrounded. Come now. And beneath it, a photograph. Marco Bianchi, on his knees in the courtyard of the DeLuca compound, hands zip-tied behind his back, blood running from a cut above his left eye. Behind him, standing with a gun held loosely at his side and a smile that looked like something borrowed from a corpse, stood Carmine Ferraro. And at the very edge of the frame, barely visible in the courtyard's security lights, Imani saw something that stopped her heart dead in her chest. Zuri's backpack. The pink one with the sparkly zipper, the one she'd left at the compound yesterday. The one Carmine was now holding up with his free hand, turning it slowly toward the camera, making sure Imani could see every glittering inch of it. The message was clear. I know where your daughter is. I know where you are. And now you know what I'm willing to do. Imani's hands began to shake. Not from fear. She'd lived with fear her entire life, and it had never made her shake. This was something else, something volcanic and ancient and so purely maternal that it bypassed every rational thought in her head and went straight to the place where survival lived, raw and red and absolute. She looked at Zuri sleeping in the bed, at Gerald the elephant with his one good ear, at the inhaler on the nightstand and the butterfly nightlight and the small, fragile universe she'd built around this child with nothing but stubbornness and love. Then Imani Carter did something she'd never done before. She called Vincenzo DeLuca's private line, the number he'd given her on her first day with the instruction to use it only in emergencies. And when he answered, breathless and hard-voiced and surrounded by sounds she didn't want to identify, she said 6 words that changed the trajectory of everything. Carmine has a picture of Zuri. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds during which the most dangerous man in the city became something far worse than a mafia boss. He became a father with nothing left to lose. The silence on the phone lasted 3 seconds. Then Vincenzo's voice came back, and it didn't sound like him anymore. It sounded like something excavated from deep underground, ancient, cold, and stripped of every human frequency she'd come to recognize over the past 3 months. Where is Zuri right now? In bed. Asleep. She's right here with me. Lock the front door, but lock the windows. Move away from any wall that faces the street. Take Zuri into the bathroom. No windows. 1 door. You can see anyone coming. Vincenzo, the backpack. He has her backpack. He's sending me a message. I know what he's sending. He's telling you he can reach her. He's wrong. He can threaten. He can hold up a backpack and take photographs. But he cannot reach her. Not tonight. Not ever. Do you hear me? I hear you. Giancarlo is 12 minutes from your apartment. He's bringing 4 men. They will stay outside your building until I come for you personally. Nobody gets past them. Nobody. What are you going to do? The pause was half a second. In that half-second, Imani heard everything. The scrape of a chair, the muffled sound of voices behind him, the metallic click of something she refused to identify. What I should have done the moment Carmine walked into my office and looked at your daughter like she was a problem to be solved. The line went dead. Imani stood in the dark apartment with the phone pressed against her ear for 3 full seconds after the call ended, listening to the silence the way you'd listen to the last note of a song you'd never hear again. Then she moved. She scooped Zuri from the bed. The girl stirred, mumbled something about Gerald, didn't fully wake, and carried her into the bathroom. The tile was cold. The fluorescent light buzzed with the same broken frequency as the one in St. Mercy Hospital a lifetime ago. She set Zuri in the bathtub with 2 blankets and Gerald the elephant and the inhaler from the nightstand, then closed the bathroom door and sat with her back against it, facing the hallway, listening. The apartment was silent except for the sounds every apartment makes when you're afraid. The refrigerator humming, the pipes ticking inside the walls, the faint creak of floorboards settling under the weight of a building that had been slowly dying for decades. 11 minutes later, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Heavy, measured, multiple sets. Then Giancarlo's voice, low and controlled through the door. "Miss Carter, we're here. 4 men on the corridor, 2 on the stairwell, 1 at each building exit. You're safe." She didn't open the door. She pressed her hand flat against the wood and felt the vibration of Giancarlo's breathing on the other side and said, "Don't let anyone through." No one gets through. She believed him. Not because she trusted the organization or the empire or the machinery of violence that made it all possible. She believed him because Giancarlo's voice carried the specific tone of a man who understood that failing tonight meant something beyond professional consequences. Something final. She stayed in the bathroom with her back against the door and her sleeping daughter in the bathtub and her phone on her knee, watching the screen, waiting for it to light up. It didn't. Across the city, Vincenzo DeLuca was standing in the basement of a restaurant on Federal Street that had been closed for 2 years but still had power, and running water, and a table large enough for 8 men to sit around without touching. The restaurant was called Palazzo's. It had belonged to Vincenzo's uncle before the uncle died of a stroke at 63, and Vincenzo had kept it off the books as a meeting point for situations that required walls nobody knew about. This was that situation. Marco sat across from him. The cut above his left eye had been cleaned and closed with butterfly strips, and the zip-tie marks on his wrists showed as raw red lines that he kept rubbing unconsciously, the way a man rubs a wound to remind himself it's real. Beside him sat Giancarlo's second, a man named Luca, who had a shaved head and a face that communicated nothing, and a reputation for being the calmest person in any room where someone was about to die. 3 other men filled the remaining chairs, soldiers who'd stayed loyal, chosen Vincenzo over Carmine in the space of a single phone call, and driven through the city's back streets to reach a dead restaurant in the fog. 6 men total. Against Carmine's 60-plus, now potentially bolstered by Moretti reinforcements, Marco was the first to speak. "He has the main compound locked down. The East Side warehouse is operating under his authority. The port office is sealed. Sal's men are running security, and they've redirected 3 shipments already. Our financial servers are compromised, which means he has access to accounts, client lists, and transaction records going back 5 years. "Elena?" Vincenzo asked. "Still unreachable, but one of my contacts at her office said she was seen leaving at 6 this evening with a briefcase and a driver we don't recognize. That could mean she's running, or it could mean she's already with Carmine. If she's with Carmine, he has the financial infrastructure." "Yes." "Then he doesn't need the Morettis for muscle. He needs them for legitimacy, to show the other families that the DeLuca organization has new leadership and it's already backed by an alliance." Marco nodded slowly. The cut above his eye was starting to seep again, a thin line of blood running into his eyebrow. He didn't wipe it. "That's the play. Carmine presents himself as the new head, backed by the Morettis, with control of operations and finances. Anyone still loyal to you has 2 choices: switch sides or disappear." "How long before the Morettis commit?" "Hours. Maybe less. Carmine's offering them the port operations, which is the only thing they've wanted from us for a decade. If they accept, We're looking at a combined force of over 100 men and the political cover to make it stick. Vincenzo looked at the table. His hands were flat on the surface, fingers spread, completely still. His face was the mask Imani had seen in the parking lot, empty of everything except the cold machinery of calculation. But behind his eyes, in the space where the calculations ran, something else was churning. Something hot and dark and personal. The photograph he sent Imani, Vincenzo said. Zuri's backpack. Marco's jaw tightened. He's using it as leverage, making sure she doesn't talk, doesn't contact authorities, doesn't do anything unpredictable. He's threatening a child. He's threatening the idea of a child. There's a difference in Carmine's mind, even if there isn't one in reality. There's no difference. Vincenzo's voice dropped to a register that made the air in the room change pressure. He held up an 8-year-old girl's backpack and pointed a camera at it to make her mother afraid. There is no version of this where that distinction matters. Silence. The kind that 6 men sit in when they understand that the conversation has moved from strategy to something more primitive. "What's the plan, boss?" Luca asked. Vincenzo looked at him, then at each man at the table, one at a time, holding eye contact long enough to read whatever was written behind their faces. "Carmine expects me to retaliate," he said. "He expects me to come at the compound with whatever men I have left, fight through his security, and try to take back control by force. That's the scenario he's prepared for. Defensive positions, reinforced entries, overlapping fields of fire. He's been planning this for weeks, maybe months. Every defensive angle is covered. So what do? We don't attack the compound." Marco looked up. "Then where?" "Carmine's power isn't in the compound. The compound is a building. His power is in the deal with the Morettis. If that deal goes through, he has legitimacy, manpower, and political cover. He wins. If that deal falls apart, he's a man sitting in a stolen building with 60 soldiers who are going to start asking themselves whether they backed the right side. How do we break the deal?" Vincenzo stood up, walked to the end of the table, turned and looked at Marco with an expression that carried the weight of 30 years of shared history. The alliances and the betrayals, the bodies and the boardrooms, the slow accumulation of sins that both men carried, but neither discussed. "I call Nico Moretti directly," Vincenzo said. "Not his people, not his consigliere. Him, personally." Marco's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, and something that looked like fear. "You haven't spoken to Nico in 6 years, not since the waterfront incident. I'm aware. He'll think it's a trap. He'll think it's desperation, and he'll be right. But desperate men tell the truth, and Nico Moretti has always respected the truth more than strength." "What truth are you going to tell him?" Vincenzo leaned forward, both hands on the table, and his shadow fell across the surface like a blade. That Carmine Ferraro threatened a child to seize power. That a man who uses an 8-year-old girl's backpack as a weapon is a man who will use anything as a weapon. And that any family who allies with that kind of man is inviting that kind of man into their house. The room was quiet. The fluorescent light overhead hummed. Water dripped somewhere in the kitchen behind the wall. "It might work," Marco said slowly. "Nico has grandchildren. He's old school. Children are off limits in his world. In every world," Vincenzo said. "That's the point." He made the call at 10:47 p.m. from a burner phone Marco had pulled from a lockbox under the restaurant floor. The number was old, stored in Vincenzo's memory the way certain numbers live in certain men's heads. Not written down, not saved in any device, just carried in the folds of the brain like a scar that never fully healed. Nico Moretti answered on the 4th ring. His voice was graveled and slow. The voice of a man in his 70s who had outlived most of his enemies and buried enough friends to know that longevity was its own kind of punishment. "Vincenzo, Nico, I'm surprised you still have this number. I'm surprised you still answer it." A pause, the sound of ice in a glass, a swallow. "Carmine Ferraro called me 2 hours ago, offered me the port operations in exchange for support. Generous offer. I told him I'd think about it." "Have you thought about it?" "I'm thinking about it now." "You calling me is part of the thinking." Vincenzo gripped the phone. His knuckles were white, but his voice was steady, controlled, operating on a frequency that allowed no tremor. "Carmine's offer is real. He has the compound, the warehouse, the port office, and probably the financial infrastructure. He can deliver what he's promising. Then why are you calling to confirm it? Because there's something he didn't tell you. When he made his move tonight, he sent a photograph to a woman who works for me. A civilian. A mother. The photograph showed her daughter's backpack, a pink backpack with a sparkly zipper, being held up by Carmine next to a man on his knees with blood on his face. The message was clear. He was telling a mother that he knew where her child was. Silence on the line. Longer this time. The ice didn't clink. The child, Nico said. How old? 8. More silence. The child wasn't harmed? The child was asleep in her bed. The backpack was left at my compound from a previous visit. Carmine found it and used it as a prop. But the intent was explicit. He wanted the mother to understand that her daughter was a piece on the board. Nico breathed. It was an old man's breath, heavy, deliberate, carrying the weight of decades of decisions that looked different at 73 than they had at 40. I have 4 granddaughters, Nico said. The youngest is 7. She has a purple backpack with butterflies on it. She takes it everywhere. Vincenzo said nothing. He'd made his argument. The rest belonged to Nico. I'm not backing Carmine Ferraro, Nico said, and I'm going to tell him why. Because a man who puts a child's belongings in a photograph next to a bloody face is a man who will eventually stop using props and start using the child, and I will not have my family's name within 100 miles of that. Thank you, Nico. Don't thank me. We're not friends, Vincenzo. We're not allies, but we are both men who understand that some lines don't move. Call me again when this is settled. We'll discuss the ports like adults. The line went dead. Vincenzo set the phone on the table and exhaled. It was the first full breath he'd taken in 2 hours, and it came out shaking. A tremor that started in his chest and worked its way through his shoulders and into his hands, where it stayed for 5 seconds before he pressed his palms flat against the table and forced the stillness back. It worked? Marco asked. The Morettis are out. Nico's going to tell Carmine directly. Marco closed his eyes, opened them. When Carmine finds out the Morettis pulled out, he's going to panic. 60 men with no alliance backing them is a very different situation than 60 men with 100 behind them. Which is why we move now, Vincenzo said. Not at the compound, at the soldiers. Carmine's people didn't follow him out of loyalty. They followed him because he promised them a winning side. Take away the Morettis and the winning side evaporates. We reach out to every soldier individually. Personal calls, direct offers. Come back now, no consequences. Wait until morning, and there are consequences. You're offering amnesty. I'm offering survival. There's a difference. Marco stood up. Luca stood up. The 3 remaining soldiers stood up. How many calls? Marco asked. All of them. Every soldier Carmine turned. We have until dawn before he regroups and finds another play. They worked through the night. 6 men in a dead restaurant, burning through burner phones, making calls that lasted between 30 seconds and 5 minutes each. The conversations were variations of the same theme. Carmine's deal with the Morettis just collapsed. The winning side isn't winning anymore. You have until sunrise to make a choice, and after sunrise, the choice gets made for you. By 2 a.m., 11 soldiers had switched back. By 3 a.m., the number was 23. By 4 a.m., when the first gray light started pushing through the fog, Carmine's force had hemorrhaged to less than 30 men. Half of Sal's port crew had gone dark, and 3 of Carmine's own lieutenants had called Marco directly, asking for terms. At 4:37 a.m., Vincenzo's phone rang. Not the burner. His personal phone. The one only 4 people in the world had the number for. The caller ID said Elena Vitale. He answered. I have the financial servers, Elena said. Her voice was flat, professional, carrying no inflection that suggested she'd just spent 10 hours playing a game with stakes measured in blood. Backup copies of everything, client lists, transaction records, account access codes. I pulled them before Carmine's people locked down the server room. I've been in a safe house on the north side since 6 p.m. waiting to see which way this went. You were waiting. I was calculating. I've been with this organization for 19 years, Vincenzo. I know what Carmine is. I also know what you're becoming. I chose to bet on the version of you that stood in a community center tonight and gave away condominiums. How did you know about that? Dorothy Price is my mother's neighbor. She called my mother before you left the parking lot. Vincenzo sat down. The chair creaked beneath him. The fluorescent light hummed. And something in his chest, not the arrhythmia, not the medication, not the physical damage, something deeper and less diagnosable, loosened by a single degree. "Come in," he said. "Bring everything." Already driving, by dawn, the mathematics had inverted. Carmine held the compound with 28 men, no alliance, no financial infrastructure, and the growing awareness that the fortress he'd seized was becoming a cage. Vincenzo had 47 soldiers, Elena's financial leverage, Nico Moretti's implicit neutrality, and something Carmine had never thought to account for. The community. Dorothy Price called at 6:15 a.m. Imani had given her Vincenzo's number during the meeting, a gesture that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried the weight of a bridge between two worlds that had never touched. "Mr. DeLuca," Dorothy said, "I hear you're having trouble with your people." News travels fast on the south side. News travels fast everywhere when it matters. I have 47 residents outside the community center right now. They heard what happened. They heard Carmine Ferraro is trying to take over, and they want you to know something. What's that? You made promises last night, to this neighborhood, to these families, to the garden on Maple Street, and we're holding you to every single one. So whatever you need to do to finish this, you finish it, because the South Side just voted, and we voted for the man who remembered his father's store. Vincenzo pressed the phone against his forehead and closed his eyes. His hand was shaking, his chest hurt, his body was running on no sleep and cold coffee and the specific kind of adrenaline that burned through the bloodstream like acid. But for 3 seconds, standing in the dead restaurant with dawn coming through the grimy windows and his empire half rebuilt from the wreckage of the night, he felt something he hadn't felt since a woman in stained scrubs told him to breathe in a broken elevator. Whole. Then the phone buzzed with a text from Marco. "Carmine wants to talk. Compound courtyard. Sunrise. Just you and him." Vincenzo looked at the message, read it twice, set the phone down. He knew what Carmine wanted. Not negotiation, not surrender. Carmine wanted to look Vincenzo in the eye and understand how the man he'd dismissed as weak, distracted, softened by a woman and a child, and the unbearable burden of being human. How that man had dismantled his coup in a single night without firing a shot. He wanted to understand, and Vincenzo was going to show him. He walked out of the restaurant into the first light of morning. The fog was lifting, pulling apart in slow gray ribbons that revealed the city beneath, battered, bruised, still standing. He got into the car. Marco drove. Neither of them spoke. The compound gates were open when they arrived. The courtyard was empty except for 2 figures. Carmine Ferraro stood at the center, hands at his sides, suit wrinkled from the night, face carrying the haggard expression of a man watching his certainties evaporate. Behind him, sitting on a stone bench near the dormant fountain, sat Sal Mancuso, slumped forward with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands, the posture of a man who had already accepted the ending. Vincenzo got out of the car, walked across the courtyard, stopped 10 feet from Carmine. The 2 men looked at each other in the early light. 27 years of shared history compressed into a silence that hummed with everything they'd built and everything they'd broken. Carmine spoke first. His voice was raw, scraped empty. "The Morettis pulled out." "Yes." "Elena had the servers." "Yes." "My men are leaving." "Most of them." Carmine's hands curled at his sides. Not into fists, something looser, more defeated, the involuntary contraction of muscles that no longer knew what they were fighting for. "You should have been finished," Carmine said. "You were in a community center doing charity work while I took everything. You had no soldiers, no weapons, no plan. How did you—" His voice cracked. He stopped, started again. "How?" Vincenzo looked at him, studied the face he'd known for nearly 3 decades, the deep-set eyes, the heavy jaw, the permanent suspicion that had once been useful and eventually became a cage. "Because you made a mistake, Carmine." "What mistake?" Vincenzo stepped closer, close enough to see the capillaries broken in Carmine's eyes from a night without sleep, close enough to smell the cigarette smoke embedded in his collar, close enough that when he spoke, the words landed with the physical weight of stones dropped into still water. "You threatened a little girl, and in doing so you told every person in this city exactly what kind of man you are. And it turns out Carmine, even in our world, even in this life, that matters. Carmine stared at him. His mouth opened, closed. His eyes were wet, though whether from exhaustion or something deeper was impossible to tell. Behind him, Sal Mancuso stood up from the bench, walked across the courtyard without looking at either of them, and disappeared through the compound gates into the morning light. Carmine and Vincenzo stood alone in the courtyard with the fountain between them, and the sun coming up over the rooftop and the sound of the city waking around them, traffic and sirens and the distant rumble of trucks on the highway, the ordinary sounds of a world that didn't know how close it had come to burning. "What happens now?" Carmine whispered. Vincenzo looked at him for a long time. Then he turned and walked back toward the car, where Marco stood waiting with the engine running and the door open and the first real sunlight of the day falling across the hood like a promise that hadn't been earned yet, but might, with enough time and enough sacrifice, be worth keeping. "Now," Vincenzo said without looking back, "you disappear." And Carmine Ferraro, standing alone in the courtyard of the empire he'd tried to steal and failed, understood with absolute and devastating clarity that disappearing was not a suggestion. It was the only mercy Vincenzo DeLuca had left to give. Carmine Ferraro disappeared on a Saturday morning. Not violently, not dramatically, not the way people disappeared in the stories told about the DeLuca family in back rooms and nightclubs across the city. He simply left. Packed one suitcase from the apartment he'd kept on the Upper West Side for 23 years, drove to the airport in a car that didn't belong to the organization, and boarded a flight to a country that didn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. Marco confirmed the departure through a contact at the airline. Vincenzo received the confirmation, read it once, set his phone on the desk, and said nothing. Sal Mancuso was easier. Sal had never been a leader. He was a follower who'd attached himself to the strongest current, and when that current reversed, he reversed with it. He came to the compound 2 days after Carmine's departure, sat in the chair across from Vincenzo's desk. The same chair where Zuri had drawn dragons, the same chair where Capos had delivered ultimatums, and placed his hands flat on his thighs with the posture of a man waiting to be sentenced. "I made a mistake," Sal said. "You made a choice," Vincenzo corrected. "Mistakes are accidental." "What happens to me?" Vincenzo studied him, the deep-set eyes, the narrow face, the way his fingers trembled against the fabric of his trousers, not with fear but with the exhaustion of a man who had spent 72 hours watching his future collapse and was now sitting in the wreckage trying to identify which pieces were still usable. "You're done at the ports," Vincenzo said. "Permanently. Marco will reassign your operations to someone who understands that loyalty isn't a weather vane." "And me?" "You go home. You stay quiet. You keep your mouth shut about everything you know, everything you've seen, and everything Carmine promised you. If I hear your name again, from anyone, for any reason, this conversation becomes the last one we ever have." Sal nodded, stood up, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back with an expression that was trying to be grateful, but landed somewhere closer to shame. "For what it's worth," Sal said, "Carmine told us you'd gone soft, that the woman had made you weak, that you didn't have it in you anymore. And you believed him. I believed what I saw. You were helping a kid with homework. You were reorganizing meeting schedules. You were talking about community gardens." Sal shook his head. "But I was wrong. What I saw wasn't weakness. I just didn't recognize what strength looked like when it wasn't holding a gun." He left. The door closed behind him with a sound that felt like punctuation, the period at the end of a sentence that had been running for too long. Vincenzo sat alone in his office for 11 minutes after Sal left. He counted them. Not deliberately. His eyes drifted to the clock on the wall and his mind tracked the movement of the minute hand with the passive attention of a man whose thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about Imani. He hadn't seen her since the night of the coup. 3 days. Giancarlo's team had stayed outside her apartment for 48 hours before Vincenzo personally called and told them to stand down. The threat was over. Carmine was gone, Sal was neutered, the soldiers had returned, and the compound was secure. But Vincenzo hadn't visited, hadn't called except for that one brief conversation to confirm the security details withdrawal, hadn't texted, hadn't sent Giancarlo with a message, hadn't done any of the things a normal person would do after the kind of night they'd shared. Because Vincenzo DeLuca wasn't sure he had the right. He'd brought her into this world, hired her, pulled her close, let her daughter into the compound, allowed the lines between professional and personal to blur until they were indistinguishable. And then his world had erupted, exactly the way it always did, exactly the way everyone warned her it would. And Imani had spent a night locked in a bathroom with her daughter because a man Vincenzo had trusted for 27 years used an 8-year-old's backpack as a weapon. He could justify everything that came before: the job offer, the schedule restructuring, the flashcards, the doll's hair. He could frame it as professional, as mentorship, as an unusual but defensible working relationship. But the truth was simpler and more damaging. He cared about her, deeply, in a way that felt like a wound reopening in slow motion, the scar tissue from Sophia's death splitting apart to reveal raw flesh underneath that hadn't seen light in 7 years. And caring about Imani meant acknowledging that every moment she spent near him put her in danger. Not hypothetical danger, not theoretical danger, the kind of danger that showed up in photographs of pink backpacks held by men with guns. So he sat in his office and stared at the clock and did nothing. Because doing nothing felt like the only responsible choice left. It was Imani who made the choice for him. She showed up at the compound on Wednesday afternoon. No call, no appointment. She walked through the front gates, past the security detail, past Giancarlo, who nodded at her with the particular respect of a man who'd stood guard outside her door for 2 nights and understood what that meant, and into Vincenzo's office without knocking. He was standing at the window, looking out at the courtyard where 3 days ago he'd told Carmine to disappear. He turned when the door opened, and for one unguarded second, his face showed everything he'd been hiding. The relief, the guilt, the fierce and terrifying want that he'd been trying to bury since the night she told him to breathe in an elevator. Then the mask came back, but slower this time, like it didn't fit as well as it used to. "You should have called first," he said. "You should have called it all." She was wearing a simple gray sweater and jeans, and her hair was pulled back, and she looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep deprivation. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there 3 months ago, and a set to her jaw that was newer, harder, forged in the specific fire of a night spent sitting on a bathroom floor, wondering if the man she'd started to trust was going to survive until morning. "Is Zuri okay?" he asked. "Zuri is fine. Zuri drew you a picture of a dragon fighting a bad guy. She asked me to bring it." Imani pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag and set it on his desk. "The dragon wins. She wanted you to know that." Vincenzo looked at the drawing. The dragon was blue. The bad guy was a scribbled figure in black, and the sky was filled with stars that Zuri had drawn as asterisks because she hadn't figured out the 5-pointed version yet. In the corner, in shaky handwriting, she'd written, "For Vincenzo." The spelling was wrong. It was the most beautiful thing he'd seen in 7 years. He picked it up. His hands were steady, but his breathing wasn't. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me the truth. There's a difference." He set the drawing down, faced her fully. No desk between them. She'd moved to the side, leaning against the bookshelf with her arms crossed in the posture he'd come to recognize as her armor. Arms crossed, weight on her heels, chin slightly raised. Ready for whatever came next but unwilling to make it easy. "The truth," he said slowly, "is that I brought you into my life because I was drowning, and you were the first person in years who made me feel like the surface was reachable. That was selfish, it was reckless, and it nearly got you and Zuri hurt. It didn't nearly get us hurt, it did hurt us. I spent a night in a bathtub with my daughter because a man I'd never met sent me a photograph of her backpack next to a bloody face. Zuri didn't see it, but I did. And I will see it every time I close my eyes for a very long time." The words landed on him like blows. Each one precise, deliberate, aimed at the exact place where his guilt lived. He absorbed them without flinching, because flinching would have been self-indulgent, and Imani deserved better than his performance of remorse. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you are. If you want to leave, if you want to walk out of this building and never come back, I will make sure you and Zuri are taken care of, financially, permanently. No strings, no conditions, no contact. You'll never hear from me again." She looked at him, studied his face the way she'd studied it in the hospital room 4 months ago. Past the surface, past the armor, past the name and the reputation and the empire. down to the man underneath, the one who braided Doll's hair, the one who remembered peppermints, the one who'd called Nico Moretti not with threats or bargains, but with the truth about a child's backpack, and turned to war without firing a shot. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "For me to leave? What I want doesn't matter." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her, and the mask, the one he'd rebuilt after Carmine, after the coup, after the courtyard, crumbled. Not dramatically, not all at once. It just stopped holding. The way a dam fails not from one crack, but from the accumulated pressure of everything behind it finally exceeding the structure's capacity to contain it. "No," he said, "I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay. I want Zuri to keep drawing dragons at that desk. I want to hear your voice telling me I'm wrong about something every single day for the rest of my life. But wanting that means accepting that I'm putting you at risk. And I don't know how to want something and protect it at the same time. I never learned how. Sophia," his voice broke on the name. He stopped, swallowed, started again. "Sophia died, and I decided the safest thing was to never care about anyone again, because caring meant losing, and losing meant feeling, and feeling was the one thing I couldn't afford. And now? Now I feel everything. And it's terrifying." Imani uncrossed her arms, let them fall to her sides, took 2 steps forward until she was standing close enough to touch him, though she didn't touch him, not yet. She stood in the space between distance and contact and looked up at him with eyes that carried everything. The fear and the anger and the exhaustion, and beneath all of it, something steady and warm and unbreakable. "You don't get to decide for me," she said. "You don't get to make the choice about what's safe and what's not safe for me and my daughter. I've been making those choices alone for 8 years, and I'm damn good at it. What you get to do is ask me, and then you get to listen to my answer." "Okay." His voice was barely audible. "I'm asking. I'm staying." He closed his eyes, opened them, and for the first time since the night Sophia died, Vincenzo DeLuca let someone see him cry. Not sobbing, he didn't have that in him, or maybe he'd burned through that capacity years ago. But his eyes filled and 2 tears tracked down his face, one on each side, following the lines that age and grief had carved into his skin like channels waiting for water. Imani reached up and wiped one away with her thumb. The gesture was small and enormous and completely without pretense. She didn't say anything. She just touched his face and let the silence hold the weight of everything they'd survived to reach this moment. Then she stepped back, crossed her arms again, raised her chin. "Now, we need to talk about the Southside project. Dorothy Price has been calling me every day since Thursday, and she has a list of demands that's longer than my arm." Something broke loose in his chest. Not grief this time. Something lighter, airier, unfamiliar. It took him a moment to identify it. Laughter. He laughed. A real laugh, rough and unpracticed, scraping its way out of his throat like a sound that had been locked in a basement for 7 years. It wasn't pretty and it wasn't elegant, and it startled Giancarlo badly enough that the man opened the office door to check before seeing the situation and retreating with an expression of profound bewilderment. "Dorothy Price," Vincenzo said, still laughing, "is going to be the death of me." "Dorothy Price is going to hold you accountable. There's a difference. In my experience, those are the same thing." 3 months passed, then 6, then a year. The changes were slow but irreversible, the way geological shifts are slow, imperceptible day to day but undeniable over time. The Southside redevelopment project broke ground in the spring, and when it did, Vincenzo was there with a hard hat that didn't fit and work boots that had never touched dirt before, and Dorothy Price standing beside him with a clipboard and the satisfied expression of a woman who'd spent her life fighting and had finally found someone worth fighting alongside. The community garden on Maple Street was not only preserved, but expanded. 3 vacant lots were converted into raised beds, and a local nonprofit took over management. The first harvest produced enough vegetables to supply the community center's weekly food distribution for 6 months. The affordable housing units went up on the old parking structure site, the same site where Vincenzo's father's grocery store had once stood. 2 buildings, 64 units total, rent capped for 20 years. The waiting list filled within a week. Vincenzo attended the ribbon cutting and stood in the back because he'd learned from Imani that not every room needed him at the front. Behind the scenes, the empire changed shape. Not overnight, not completely. Vincenzo was still Vincenzo DeLuca, And the organization he'd built over 3 decades didn't transform into a charitable foundation because its leader had a change of heart. But the center of gravity shifted. Legitimate businesses expanded. The financial infrastructure Elena managed was restructured to reduce exposure to the operations that kept federal prosecutors awake at night. Younger leadership took over the segments of the empire that Vincenzo no longer wanted his fingerprints on. Marco watched all of it with the careful attention of a man who'd seen transformations before and knew that most of them didn't survive contact with reality. But this one was different. This one had Imani Carter standing at the center of it, asking questions that nobody wanted to answer and making demands that nobody wanted to meet and refusing, absolutely refusing, to let the organization's worst impulses go unchallenged. "She's going to get you killed," Marco told Vincenzo one afternoon, not for the first time. "She's going to get me saved," Vincenzo replied. Same difference. The proposal happened on an evening in late autumn, not in the compound, not in a restaurant or a rooftop bar, or any of the dramatic settings that a man of Vincenzo's resources could have arranged. It happened in the community garden on Maple Street at 6:30 in the evening, with the sun going down behind the buildings and the garden's solar-powered fairy lights just starting to flicker on in the fading daylight. Zuri was there. She was 9 now, taller, sharper, still carrying Gerald the elephant everywhere, despite the fact that both ears were now held on by dental floss and hope. Her asthma was under control. The medication was no longer a calculation made in desperation, but a routine managed by excellent insurance and a pediatric specialist who made house calls because Vincenzo DeLuca's assistant had asked, and when Imani Carter asked, things happened. Zuri was helping Dorothy Price plant winter kale in the raised beds when she looked up and saw Vincenzo walking toward them through the garden gate. He was carrying something in his hand, not a ring box. That would come later from his pocket at the appropriate moment. He was carrying a folder. "What's that?" Imani asked. She was standing near the tomato trellises with dirt on her hands and her hair escaping from the band she'd used to pull it back. And she looked more beautiful to Vincenzo in that moment than any woman he'd ever seen in any room he'd ever entered. "This," he said, "is the deed to the corner lot on 10th and Maple, the one where my father's grocery store stood." She took the folder, opened it, read the first page. "This is in Zuri's name." "Yes. You put a piece of property in my 9-year-old daughter's name. It belongs to the neighborhood, but the neighborhood needs a custodian, and I wanted it to be someone who will still be here in 50 years, making sure nobody turns it into a parking structure again." Zuri seemed like the right choice. She has strong opinions about land use. She has strong opinions about everything. She gets that from me. "I know." Imani closed the folder, looked at him. The garden was quiet except for Dorothy's voice explaining to Zuri the difference between winter kale and spring kale, and the hum of the fairy lights, and the distant sounds of the city going about its business beyond the garden walls. "Is there something else?" she asked. Because she knew him. She knew the way he built toward things, slowly, deliberately, laying foundations before revealing the structure above them. Vincenzo reached into his pocket, and the most feared man in the city, the man who'd built an empire from shadows and nearly lost it because he dared to sit in a community center and remember his father, dropped to one knee in a vegetable garden with dirt on his shoes and fairy lights in his hair and his damaged heart hammering against his ribs. "I spent my whole life building an empire," he said. His voice cracked on the word empire, and he didn't fix it, just let it crack, let the imperfections stand. "I built it out of fear and control and the belief that power was the only thing that could keep me safe. I was wrong about all of it." Imani looked down at him. Her hands were shaking. The folder was still clutched against her chest. "You and Zuri are the first things that ever felt like home," he said. "Not the compound, not the organization, not any of it. You. The woman who pushed my wheelchair and told me to breathe and refused to call me boss and made me stand in a room full of strangers and be human. I don't deserve you. I know that. But I'm asking anyway because you told me that I don't get to decide for you. So I'm not deciding. I'm asking." Zuri had stopped planting kale. She was standing 3 rows away with dirt on her knees and Gerald under her arm, watching with eyes so wide they seemed to take up half her face. "Mommy," she whispered, "say yes." Imani laughed. It was a wet, broken, beautiful sound. Half sob, half joy, entirely human. She looked at her daughter, then at the man on his knees, then at the garden around them, the garden that was supposed to be demolished, the garden that existed because a woman in broken shoes had told a mafia boss to go talk to his neighbors. Yes, she said. Vincenzo stood up. His knees protested. He was 54 years old with a cardiac condition and a lifetime of damage, and kneeling on garden soil wasn't kind to any of those things. But he stood, and Imani stepped into him, and he wrapped his arms around her and held her with the desperate tenderness of a man who'd finally stopped running from the thing he wanted most. Zuri crashed into both of them 3 seconds later, arms around their legs. Gerald squashed between them, laughing and crying and asking if this meant she could have a dog. Dorothy Price watched from the raised beds with a handful of kale seedlings and an expression that combined satisfaction and skepticism in equal measure. "Don't mess this up, DeLuca," she called across the garden. Vincenzo looked at her over Imani's shoulder, with Zuri clinging to his leg and fairy lights reflected in his wet eyes. "Yes, ma'am," he said. One evening, months later, they stood together in the finished garden. The Maple Street lot had been transformed. Raised beds, a small greenhouse, a mural on the back wall painted by local teenagers depicting the neighborhood's history in bright, overlapping colors. Children played between the rows while their parents sat on benches that Vincenzo had commissioned from a local carpenter, each one bearing a small brass plate with the name of a family that had lived on the block for more than 20 years. The city's skyline rose behind the garden walls, catching the last of the day's light. Vincenzo stood with his arm around Imani's waist, watching the children run, listening to the sounds of a neighborhood that was rebuilding itself one garden bed at a time. "All this," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "because you stopped to help a stranger." Imani rested her head against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat through the fabric of his shirt. Steady, strong, carrying the rhythm of a man who'd been given a second chance and was spending every day trying to earn it. "No," she whispered, "because even monsters deserve one chance to be loved." Vincenzo pressed his lips against the top of her head, closed his eyes, breathed. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the breathing didn't hurt. The fairy lights hummed softly in the dusk. Zuri's laughter carried across the garden, high and clear and unbroken. The city moved around them, sirens and traffic and the endless grinding machinery of a world that would never be fully fixed. But here, in this small square of reclaimed earth, between the kale and the tomatoes and the mural that told the story of a neighborhood that refused to disappear, something had taken root. Not perfection, not redemption. Something smaller and more honest than either of those. A beginning.